this is without any reference to the fact that procurement as a whole should be benefiting countries of the Global South as part of a development strategy, in our view. Debt and Development Coalition Ireland is an all-Ireland organisation where we really welcome membership from global justice organisations in Northern Ireland. And yet when we carry out our popular education work in the North, there is no traction there in terms of any foreign policy power to influence either the Irish government or the UK government, which has an even more questionable position on debt issues now, where it's refusing to support further debt cancellation measures for southern countries, or even a more minimal demand, which we have been campaigning on for a long time, which is the concept of debt audits for countries of the South, so that people at least can be given greater access to debt-based information and evaluation documentation from the lenders who have lent massive amounts of money to their governments. A major part of the question for what kind of national independence Ireland exercises in terms of its relationships with countries of the South must also be examined in terms of our membership of the European Union. And we could have said maybe 10 years ago, back in 2002, that despite it not living up to our standards of justice in the global justice movement and the debt justice movement, that the European Union was viewed as a more progressive bloc in terms of international development issues through the Monterrey Conference in 2002, the Kyoto Conference, where the EU was not pushing what we felt it should be, but was certainly not the lowest common denominator. That was in the era of the Bush regime, which was really disengaging from any kind of multilateralism. But we can no longer say that, because the European Union has this sort of collective, more progressive action has completely broken down as far as we can see it. It can certainly no longer hold any high moral ground, because it has such sub-imperial relationships within the European Union itself, which is something we can see in terms of the treatment of surplus countries towards indebted countries in the European Union. And we have a changing dynamic internationally because, we've a changing dynamic internationally because the southern countries are beginning to fight back, but fight back in different ways, where we've seen since 2003 at the World Trade Organization meeting in Cancun in Mexico, the countries of the South banded together in order to refuse to accept an unfair global trade rules deal. That was one of the first most significant signals that we saw of this sort of collective action from countries of the Global South. And now we see that in the big and powerful international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, where there is much more coordinated and collective action and stronger negotiation happening from the so-called BRIC countries of Brazil and Russia and India and China. And not always for progressive reasons, it has to be said too. We also see a very significant shift, which I think will also lead to Ireland being less shy about being more upfront about its own economic interests in countries of the South, where we're seeing what we call the private turn in international development, where private flows from international development organisations are much, much higher. For example, public loans from public institutions, lending institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and development finance institutions like the European Investment Bank have significantly increased since the year 2000, from 5 billion to 22 billion in 2008. We're seeing that the International Finance Corporation, an arm of the World Bank Group, is going to become one of the biggest and most powerful arm of the World Bank Group, which originally was set up in order to tackle poverty, but the IFC has a really damaging track record on channeling public funds to major multinational companies to deliver development on their behalf. So what are some of the just alternative possibilities, justice-centred possibilities for Ireland's international development policies in light of this? Well, the things that we have been calling for nearly 2 decades now in Debt and Development Coalition is debt justice for countries of the South who have historically illegitimate and unjust debts in our view. So we have been calling for increased debt cancellation, an end to policy conditionality, which has structurally disadvantaged the economies of countries of the Global South, and a call for regulation and internationally binding lending and borrowing standards. International tax justice comes as the other side of the coin to this issue for us as a campaigning organisation in order to stop the flow of stolen money from countries of the Global South, which is leading them to this deeply imbalanced dependence on external debt, through challenging multinationals' power by making them more transparent. So one of the calls that we have been trying to get the Irish government to endorse is country-by-country financial reporting for multinational companies, so that we can identify how much profits are being made and taxes are being paid by multinational corporations. What is the current Irish government's position on this? Well, they repeat their progressive 2002 stance on international debt questions, but say very little more, not least because we are now more indebted than the majority of countries of the Global South, except perhaps for some Caribbean countries. And on the tax issue, we've seen one kind of small turnaround in terms of supporting some more progressive EU legislation in terms of a review of international directives on multinational companies reporting in the extractives industry. But we see this as very much a kind of protection of reputational image, rather than clearly taking on a tax justice agenda, not least because Ireland itself is acting as a shelter for multinational companies in questionable ways, potentially. So how do we move to this more just agenda? Because it would be, in my view, such a massive shift to achieve that sort of attitude by our political representatives. And so it does seem extremely out of reach, not least because we have now lost our economic sovereignty in a very similar way to countries of the Global South. Well, I suppose just some campaigning observations, because I'm not an academic, I'm an activist, that we can see, maybe it would be good to discuss some of the patterns that we can see in civil society organising around this. How do we assert a truly national and principled internationalist agenda? And I think what we can see, unfortunately, in this time of crisis is activist groups and civil society organisations rushing, understandably, to protect their own areas of concern, whether it's groups that work on pensions or disability groups. That's then even that rush to protect and defend those resources are being covered very unfairly by the Irish media, in my view. So the challenge, I think, for us is the long-term vision of social movement building. And the question is, how do we do this? These are not new ideas. I think it necessitates things that we've been trying to do for a long time, of linking groups that work on local injustice and exploitation with groups that work on the global, and overcoming our sectoral divides between our areas of work, political work. I appreciate this sounds very obvious, but I also think in practice that it has proved very challenging for the Irish left to achieve this. And I think it takes a lot of new thinking and more intellectual depth and understanding, certainly from a global justice organisation that's now starting to work on the Irish debt crisis and campaigning against illegitimate debts in Ireland. We have found there has been a deep need for mutual trust building between organisations in order to campaign on this question. So maybe I'll end there, and I hope I've provoked a bit of discussion.
Right. I want to introduce my next speaker, who is Conor McCarthy. He will be speaking on a different aspect of the question of national independence, about the post-colonial and partitionist mentality. And Conor's interests lie in the history of ideas and in Irish intellectual history. He is also interested in the history of Marxism, in post-colonial theory, and in the way political and literary thoughts intersect. At the moment, he is a lecturer in English at the Maynooth University and the author of a number of books and pamphlets. So I'll just call him...
Just two things just to start off with. First of all, it's a great honour to be here at all, or in the first place, maybe not at all. Having been an attendee of the school in past years, it's always nice to actually be asked to be a participant. Also, I have a cold and a scratchy throat, so if I dissolve into helpless choking at some point, I hope that you'll bear with me for a moment. My remit was to talk about something called the post-colonial and partitionist mentality, and I will try to do that. But I want to start off by, if you want, rejecting the term mentality, because I'm not sure that's entirely useful. The title, the post-colonial and partitionist mentality, suggests that, of course, that post-colonial and partitionist ideas were singular, that they were unitary, that they were coherent and unified in the island of Ireland after the 1920s. Let me just parse the term mentality for a moment. At its simplest, it seems to me that the term means habitual mental state that involves not only values and ideas, but also feelings and beliefs that come together to cause a disposition and a capacity in a person or in a collective of persons. It appears to suggest mental or psychological structures ingrained in people, if you want. But it also suggests something like a faculty of mind, a creative capacity. This shapelessness of the term, of course, is part of what makes it so useful, or part of what makes it so widely used. The term I'd associated chiefly now with a particular branch of French history writing, associated with but not identical to a great French school called the Analyst school, identified with people like Marc Bloch and with contemporary writers like Pierre Nora. But the point would be that this history of mentalities, as the French call it, is a mode of history writing that is deeply interested in social and cultural history, which is germane to our purposes, or germane to mine, as against the history of high politics. But at the same time, it is fundamentally hostile to Marxist history writing. It has no interest in class. It's inclined to consider intellectual and cultural trends as mostly autonomous or free of economic structures and patterns. I'm going to quote an American historian of this French historiography. He says, Patrick Hutton says, while now historians are most likely to address the material realities conditioning man through economic processes, social structures and environmental influences, these historians, the historians of mentalities, investigating mentalities, prefer to consider the psychological realities underpinning human conceptions of intimate relationships, basic habits of mind, and attitudes towards the elemental passages of life. In other words, this term mentality seems to me to conjure up an essentially idealist as against materialist and not fully grounded conception of post-colonial and post-partition society. And this doesn't seem to me to be the way to proceed. Because it does seem to me to be useful and pertinent to talk about the ideological after effects of the independence and secessionist struggles and of the partition statements that were brought to birth in the 1920s. We have to remember, nevertheless, that ideology in broad Marxist terms can be seen and analysed as a resolution on the imaginary level, if you want, or the ideal level, of real contradictions in the real structures and processes of a society or of societies. If we are to speak of the cultural or ideological or intellectual effects and legacies of the revolutionary period, and in truth, of course, these legacies have causes that run much deeper in history than just from the period itself, if you want, then we must see these effects as both a reflection, these ideological effects as both a reflection and a cause of real social, economic, and political arrangements. For me, it's long seemed that the struggle that was fought out across Ireland, north and south, between 1912 and 1925, roughly speaking, was one waged by its conventionally defined principal protagonists as one over sovereignty, a word that has been greatly used over this weekend. Sovereignty, conventionally defined, as Sheila pointed out to us yesterday, is the supreme authority over a territory. As we know, the struggle itself created multiple fracture lines in Irish society, along lines of class, lines of gender, region, locality, religion, language.